It's time to get nerdy, y'all.
A little bit of gaming history for you.
Something relevant in gaming and discuss our opinions on it.
Should we kick it out of here, or should we kick-start it?
This is the part where you, the listeners, try to stump the hosts.
I'm not a lawyer, I just play one on a podcast. Ladies and gentlethems, a special treat for you today. It's often referenced by myself as well as Mr. Nice Guy that video games are art. And we've talked in the past in certain legalese segments of the show about how exactly that came about. The case name was Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association. And though we don't have a usual presentation today, I did want to give you a little something, so I figured maybe I'd go ahead and read for you the opinion. Now, the opinion comes in 4 pieces, and we'll only do one today. That is the opinion for the majority, written by Justice Scalia. There was a concurrence written by Alito. Justice Thomas made a dissent, and Justice Breyer also had a dissent. So today we're just going to use the main opinion. We consider whether a California law imposing restrictions on violent video games comports with the First Amendment. 1. California Assembly Bill 1179, passed in 2005, prohibits the sale or rental of violent video games to minors and requires their packaging to be labeled 18. The act covers games in which the range of options available to a player includes killing, maiming, dismembering, or sexually assaulting an image of a human being if those acts are depicted, in a manner that a reasonable person, considering the game as a whole, would find appeals to a deviant or morbid interest of minors, that is patently offensive to prevailing standards in the community as to what is suitable for minors, and that causes the game as a whole to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors. Violation of the act is punishable by a civil fine of up to $1,000. Respondents, representing the video game and software industries, brought a pre-enforcement challenge to the act in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. That court concluded that the act violated the First Amendment and permanently enjoined its enforcement. See Video Software Dealers Association v. Schwarzenegger. The Court of Appeals affirmed that case, and we granted certiorari. 2. California correctly acknowledges that video games qualify for First Amendment protection. The free speech clause exists principally to protect discourse on public matters, but we have long recognized that it is difficult to distinguish politics from entertainment and dangerous to try. Quote, everyone is familiar with instances of propaganda through fiction. What is one man's amusement teaches another's doctrine. End quote. Winters v. New York, 1948. Like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas, and even social messages, through many familiar literary devices, such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music, and through features distinctive to the medium, such as the player's interaction with the virtual world. That suffices to confer First Amendment protection. Under our Constitution, quote, aesthetic and moral judgments about art and literature are for the individual to make, not for the government to decree, even with the mandate or approval of a majority, end quote. That's United States v. Playboy from 2000. And whatever the challenges of applying the Constitution to ever-advancing technology, quote, the basic principles of freedom of speech and the press, like the First Amendment's command, do not vary, end quote, when a new and different medium for communication appears. That's Joseph Bertrand Inc. v. Wilson from 1952. The most basic of those principles is this, quote, as a general matter, government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content, end quote. Ashcroft v. ACLU, 2002. There are, of course, exceptions. Quote, from 1791 to the present, the First Amendment has permitted restrictions upon the content of speech in a few limited areas, and has never included a freedom to disregard these traditional limitations. It's United States v. Stevens, 2010. These limited areas, such as obscenity, Roth v. United States, 1957, incitement, Brandenburg v. Ohio, 1969, and fighting words, Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire, 1942, represent well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problem. Last term, in Stevens, we held that new categories of unprotected speech may not be added to the list by a legislature that concludes certain speech is too harmful to be tolerated. Stevens concerned a federal statute purporting to criminalize the creation, sale, or possession of certain depictions of animal cruelty. The statute covered depictions, quote, in which a living animal is intentionally maimed, mutilated, tortured, wounded, or killed, end quote. If that harm to the animal was illegal, where the, quote, creation, sale, or possession took place. A saving clause largely borrowed from our obscenity jurisprudence, see Miller v. California, 73, exempted depictions with serious religious, political, scientific, educational, journalistic, historical, or artistic value. We held that statute to be an impermissible content-based restriction on speech. There was no American tradition of forbidding the depiction of animal cruelty, though states have long had laws against committing it. The government argued in Stevens that lack of historical warrant did not matter, that it could create new categories of unprotected speech by applying a simple balancing test that weighs the value of a particular category of speech against its social costs, and then punishes that category of speech if it fails the test. We emphatically rejected that startling and dangerous proposition. Maybe there are some categories of speech that have been historically unprotected, but have not yet been specifically identified or discussed as such in our case law. But without persuasive evidence that a novel restriction on content is part of a long, if heretofore unrecognized, tradition of prescription, a legislature may not revise the judgment of the American people embodied in the First Amendment that the benefits of its restrictions on the government outweigh the costs. That holding controls this case. As in Stevens, California has tried to make violent speech regulation look like obscenity regulation by appending a saving clause required for the latter. That does not suffice. Our cases have been clear that the obscenity exception to the First Amendment does not cover whatever a legislature finds shocking, but only depictions of sexual conduct. See Cohen v. California, 1971. Stevens was not the first time that we have witnessed and rejected a state's attempt to shoehorn speech about violence into obscenity. In Winters, we considered a New York criminal statute forbidding the massing of stories of bloodshed and lust in such a way as to incite crime against the person. The New York Court of Appeals upheld the provision as a law against obscenity. Quote, there can be no more precise test of written indecency or obscenity, it said, than the continuing and changeable experience of the community as to what types of books are likely to bring about the corruption of public morals or other analogous injury to the public order, end quote. That is, of course, the same expansive view of governmental power to abridge the freedom of speech based on interest balancing that we rejected in Stevens. Our opinion in Winters, which concluded that the New York statute failed a heightened vagueness standard applicable to the restrictions upon speech entitled to First Amendment protection, made clear that violence is not part of the obscenity that the Constitution permits to be regulated. The speech reached by the statute contained no indecency or obscenity in any sense heretofore known to the law. Because speech about violence is not obscene, it is of no consequence that California's statute mimics the New York statute regulating obscenity for minors that we upheld in Ginsburg v. New York in 1968. That case approved a prohibition on the sale to minors of sexual material that would be obscene from the perspective of a child. we held that the legislature could adjust the definition of obscenity to social realities by permitting the appeal of this type of material to be assessed in terms of the sexual interests of minors. And because obscenity is not protected expression, the New York statute could be sustained so long as the legislature's judgment that the prescribed materials were harmful to children was not irrational. The California Act is something else entirely. It does not adjust the boundaries of an existing category of unprotected speech to ensure that a definition designed for adults is not uncritically applied to children. California does not argue that it is empowered to prohibit selling offensively violent works to adults, and it is wise not to, since that is but a hair's breadth from the argument rejected in Stevens. Instead, it wishes to create a wholly new category of content-based regulation that is permissible only for speech directed at children. That is unprecedented and mistaken. Quote, minors are entitled to a significant measure of First Amendment protection, and only in relatively narrow and well-defined circumstances may government bar public dissemination of protected materials to them. Ayers Nonzik v. Jacksonville, 1975. No doubt, a state possesses legitimate power to protect children from harm, but that does not include a free-floating power to restrict the ideas to which children may be exposed. Quote, speech that is neither obscene as to youths nor subject to some other legitimate prescription cannot be suppressed solely to protect the young from ideas or images that a legislative body thinks is unsuitable for them. California's argument would fare better if there were a long-standing tradition in this country of specifically restricting children's access to depictions of violence. But there is none. Certainly, the books we give children to read, or read to them when they are younger, contain no shortage of gore. Grimm's fairy tales, for example, are grim indeed. As her just deserts for trying to poison Snow White, the wicked queen is made to dance in red-hot slippers till she fell dead on the floor, a sad example of envy and jealousy. Cinderella's evil stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by doves. And Hansel and Gretel, children, kill their captor by baking her in an oven. High school reading lists are full of similar fare. Homer's Odysseus blinds the Cyclops by gouging out his eye with heated steak. In the Inferno, Dante and Virgil watch corrupt politicians struggle to stay submerged beneath a lake of boiling pitch, lest they be skewered by devils above the surface. And Golding's Lord of the Flies recounts how a schoolboy called Piggy is savagely murdered by other children while marooned on an island. This is not to say that minors' consumption of violent entertainment has never encountered resistance. In the 1800s, dime novels depicting crime and penny dreadfuls, named for their price and content, were blamed in some quarters for juvenile delinquency. When motion pictures came along, they became the villains instead. Quote, the days when the police looked upon dime novels as the most dangerous of textbooks in the school for crime are drawing to a close. They say that the moving picture machine tends even more than did the dime novel to help turn the thoughts of the easily influenced to paths which sometimes lead to prison. End quote. That's from a New York Times article in 1909. For a time, our court did permit broad censorship of movies because of their capacity to be, quote, used for evil. See Mutual Film Corp. v. Industrial Column of Ohio, 1915. But we eventually reversed course, invalidating a drive-in movies restriction designed to protect children. Radio dramas were next, and then came comic books. Many in the late 1940s and early 1950s blamed comic books for fostering a, quote, preoccupation with violence and horror, end quote, among the young, leading to a rising in juvenile crime. But efforts to convince Congress to restrict comic books failed. And of course, after comic books came television and music lyrics. California claims that video games present special problems because they are interactive, in that the player participates in the violent action on screen and determines its outcome. The latter feature is nothing new, since at least the publication of The Adventures of You, Sugarcane Island, In 1969, young readers of choose-your-own-adventure stories have been able to make decisions and determine the plot by following instructions about which page to turn to. As for the argument that video games enable participation in the violent action, that seems to us more a matter of degree than of kind. As Judge Posner has observed, all literature is interactive. Quote, "The better it is, the more interactive. Literature, when it is successful, draws the reader into the story, makes them identify with the characters, invites her to judge them and quarrel with them, to experience their joys and sufferings as the reader's own." American Amusement Machine Association v. Kendrick, 2001, striking down a similar restriction on violent video games. Justice Alito has done considerable independent research to identify video games in which the violence is astounding. Victims are dismembered, decapitated, disemboweled, set on fire, and chopped into little pieces. Blood gushes, splatters, and pools. Justice Alito recounts all these disgusting video games in order to disgust us, but disgust is not a valid basis for restricting expression. And the same is true of Justice Alito's description of those video games he has discovered that have a racial or ethnic motive for their violence. Ethnic cleansing of African Americans, Latinos, or Jews. To what end does he relate this? Does it somehow increase the aggressiveness that California wishes to suppress? Who knows? But it does arouse the reader's ire, and the reader's desire to put an end to this horrible message. Thus, ironically, Justice Alito's argument highlights the precise danger posed by the California Act. That the ideas expressed by speech, whether it be violence or gore or racism, and not its objective effects, may be the real reason for governmental prescription. 3. Because the Act imposes a restriction on the content of protected speech, it is invalid unless California can demonstrate that it passes strict scrutiny. That is, unless it is justified by a compelling government interest and is narrowly drawn to serve that interest. The state must specifically identify an actual problem in need of solving, and the curtailment of free speech must be actually necessary to the solution. That is a demanding standard. It is rare that a regulation restricting speech because of its content will ever be permissible. California cannot meet that standard. At the outset, it acknowledges that it cannot show a direct causal link between violent video games and harm to minors. Rather, relying upon our decision in Turner Broadcasting System v. FCC from 1994, the state claims that it need not produce such proof because the legislature can make a predictive judgment that a link exists based upon competing psychological studies. But reliance on Turner Broadcasting is misplaced. That decision applied intermediate scrutiny to a content-neutral regulation. California's burden is much higher, and because it bears the risk of uncertainty, ambiguous proof will not suffice. The state's evidence is not compelling. California relies primarily on the research of Dr. Craig Anderson and on a few other research psychologists whose studies purport to show a connection between exposure to violent video games and harmful effects on children. These studies have been rejected by every court to consider them, and with good reason. They do not prove that violent video games cause minors to act aggressively, which would at least be a beginning. Instead, nearly all of the research is based on correlation, not evidence of causation, and most of the studies suffer from significant admitted flaws in methodology. They show, at best, some correlation between exposure to violent entertainment and minuscule real-world effects, such as children's feeling more aggressive, or making louder noises in the few minutes after playing a violent game than after playing a non-violent game. Even taking for granted Dr. Anderson's conclusions that violent video games produce some effects on children's feelings of aggression, those effects are both small and indistinguishable from effects produced by other media. In his testimony in a similar lawsuit, Dr. Anderson admitted that the effect sizes of children's exposure to violent video games are about the same as that produced by their exposure to violence on television. and he admits that the same effects have been found when children were watching cartoons starring Bugs Bunny or the Roadrunner, or when they play video games like Sonic the Hedgehog that are rated E, or even when they view a picture of a gun. Of course, California has wisely declined to restrict Saturday morning cartoons, the sale of games rated for young children, or the distribution of pictures of guns. The consequence is that its regulation is wildly under-inclusive when judged against its assertive justification, which in our view is alone enough to defeat it. Under-inclusiveness raises serious doubts about whether the government is in fact pursuing the interest it invokes, rather than disfavoring a particular speaker or viewpoint. See City of Ladue v. Galileo, 1994. Here, California has singled out the purveyors of video games for disfavored treatment, at least when compared to booksellers, cartoonists, and movie producers, and has given no persuasive reason why. The act is also seriously under-inclusive in another respect, and a respect that renders irrelevant the contentions of the concurrence and the dissents that video games are qualitatively different from other portrayals of violence. The California legislature is perfectly willing to leave this dangerous, mind-altering material in the hands of children so long as one parent, or even an aunt or an uncle, says it's okay. And there are not even any requirements as to how this parental relationship is to be verified. Apparently, the adults say so suffices. And that is not how one addresses a serious social problem. California claims that the act is justified in aid of parental authority. By requiring that the purchase of violent video games can only be made by adults, the act ensures that parents can decide what games are appropriate. At the outset, we note our doubts that punishing third parties for conveying protected speech to children just in case their parents disapprove of that speech is a proper government means of aiding parental authority. Accepting that position would largely vitiate the rule that only in relatively narrow and well-defined circumstances may governments bar public dissemination of protected materials to minors. But leaving that aside, California cannot show that the Act's restrictions meet a substantial need of parents who wish to restrict their children's access to violent video games but cannot do so. The video game industry has in place a voluntary rating system designed to inform consumers about the content of games. The system, implemented by the Entertainment Software Rating Board, assigns age-specific ratings to each video game submitted. EC for early childhood, E for everyone, E10+, for everyone 10 and older, T for teens, M for 17 and older, and AO for adults only. The Video Software Dealers Association encourages retailers to prominently display information about the ESRB system in their stores, to refrain from renting or selling adults-only games to minors, and to rent or sell M-rated games to minors only with the parental consent. In 2009, the Federal Trade Commission found that as a result of this system, the video game industry outpaces the movie and music industries in 1. Restricting target marketing of mature-related products to children, 2. Clearly and prominently disclosing rating information, and 3. Restricting children's access to mature-related products at retail. This system does much to ensure that minors cannot purchase seriously violent games on their own, and that parents who care about the matter can readily evaluate the games their children bring home. Filling the remaining modest gap in concerned parents' control can hardly be a compelling state interest. And finally, the Act's purported aid to parental authority is vastly over-inclusive. Not all of the children who are forbidden to purchase violent video games on their own have parents who care whether they purchase violent video games. While some of the legislation's effect may indeed be in support of what some parents of the restricted children actually want, its entire effect is only in support of what the state thinks parents ought to want. This is not the narrow tailoring to assisting parents that restriction of the First Amendment rights requires. California's effort to regulate violent video games is the latest episode in a long series of failed attempts to censor violent entertainment for minors. While we have pointed out above that some of the evidence brought forward to support the harmfulness of video games is unpersuasive, we do not mean to demean or disparage the concerns that underlie the attempt to regulate them. Concerns that may, and doubtless do, prompt a good deal of parental oversight. We have no business passing judgment on the view of the California legislature that violent video games, or for that matter any forms of speech, corrupt the young or harm their moral development. Our task is only to say whether or not such works constitute a, quote, well-defined and narrowly limited class of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problem. End quote. The answer is plainly no, and if not, whether the regulation of such works is justified by that high degree of necessity we have described as a compelling state interest. It is not. Even where the protection of children is the object, the constitutional limits on governmental action apply. California's legislation straddles the fence between 1, addressing a serious social problem, and 2, helping concerned parents control their children. Both ends are legitimate, but when they affect First Amendment rights, they must be pursued by means that are neither seriously under-inclusive nor seriously over-inclusive. As a means of protecting children from portrayals of violence, the legislation is seriously under-inclusive, not only because it excludes portrayals other than video games, but also because it permits a parental veto. And as a means of assisting concerned parents, it is seriously over-inclusive because it abridges the First Amendment rights of young people whose parents, and aunts and uncles, think violent video games are a harmless pastime. And the overbreadth in achieving one goal is not cured by the underbreadth in achieving the other. Legislation such as this, which is neither fish nor fowl, cannot survive strict scrutiny. We affirm the judgment. It is so ordered. Well, there you have it, fellow nerds. That is the main opinion, the majority opinion, the main holding of Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association. Now, we are going to take a look at the concurrence as well as the 2 dissents so that we can get a good idea of what some of the other people on the court thought about it at that time. I know that at least one of them, Thomas's dissent, is interesting to say the least. So, thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time for another bonus episode. Keep it nerdy. We'll see you later. Bye.